Welcome to the Language Fuel podcast. Our mission is to fuel the teaching and learning of languages worldwide. I'm your host, Joanna Smith. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Language Fuel podcast. Thanks for joining us. Today on our podcast, we're going to have a look at the criteria for choosing a textbook, or how do you evaluate a textbook if you're looking for one to use in your language class. Some of you may be aware that here in New Zealand, I run the Language Fuel Resource Room, which is a bookshop, and we specialize in languages materials. So as well as textbooks, we also sell games and little prizes and things like that. But the majority of the business is about textbooks. And I have a lot of people asking me which textbook would be best or most appropriate for my, year 9 French class, for example. And so this is something that I'm doing on a day-to-day basis. And recently it was nice to meet up with some old colleagues who are still teaching at the institution I taught at for many years. And they are looking at changing their textbooks. So we had some of them around to the office and they looked through many different English books that were available for the appropriate market that they were working in. So it's something that many language teachers and heads of department and so on need to think about regularly. Every academic year you have the opportunity to evaluate whether or not the textbooks you're currently using, if you are working through one, are they still appropriate for the students that you're teaching. So I thought I would create a list for you, and I'll create a downloadable PDF for you to print out on the website in the show notes. So feel free to download that either as you listen or later on so that you can use this checklist, if you like, in your day-to-day practice if you're looking at a textbook. So the first thing to think about when you're choosing a book is whether or not you are teaching to a very specific curriculum, and if you are, whether there are books out there that teach to that curriculum. So I'm thinking, for example, I know that in the UK, there are AQA exams or EdXL exams, these examination boards that prescribe a set criteria. Those are the exams your students will be sitting at the end of the academic year. So it makes a whole lot of sense in an environment like that to use one of the textbooks that they have sponsored or approved, which suggests that the material in it will prepare the students adequately for the exams that they're going to be taking. Now, if you're in that situation, there's probably only 2 or 3 different types of textbooks you could choose from, and you can use the rest of the criteria to help you decide there. Here in New Zealand, it's not quite as easy because we have, our own set of criteria in the New Zealand Qualifications Authority and unit standards and all that the students will be working towards. And there isn't actually, in most subjects, most languages here, there isn't a New Zealand-based textbook. So we don't have the luxury of saying, oh, I just need an AQA book or something like that. So we are looking at UK textbooks and Australian-based textbooks, maybe US-based published textbooks, and trying to decide. So if you do have a curriculum you're working at, and if there are textbooks written specifically for it, I think that's great. You can just go with those ones. For everybody else, and those in private language schools who may not necessarily be working towards an exam as such, then all the rest of the criteria should come into play for you. So the first thing you really need to think about when you're choosing a textbook is, does the textbook cover all 4 of the main skills of languages? So that's listening and speaking, the oral skills, and then reading and writing, the paper-based skills. Those main 4 skills should all be represented in the textbook. Now, obviously, there are exceptions to this. If you're teaching a conversation class, then you may not choose a textbook that has a lot of writing exercises. Conversely, if you're teaching an academic writing class, you probably don't need all the speaking and listening exercises. So obviously, you're going to need to think about that. But in terms of a general language class, you want to make sure you're covering all 4 skills and sort of roughly equally and trying to balance them out a little bit. And then I thought we'd just go through each of the individual skills and have a look at what you're looking at in those areas. So in terms of listening exercises that may be available in the textbook, you want to be thinking about which accents the textbook is presenting students to listen to. So When I take English as an example, a lot of migrants to New Zealand, they may have learned English before they came, or international students, they learn English in their home country before they've travelled, and they may have been used to listening to an American accent in the textbooks they're using, or a British accent. If they're from Europe, it's often the British as the reference accent. So, it can be quite a challenge for them to change. And I'm not saying you need to only give them that accent to work with. In fact, my point is quite the opposite. A range of accents is better so that they can have a lot more practice and exposure to different English accents. It would be a bit of a shame to have only one accent to work with your students. And the accent, if there is a majority accent that is being used, is it suitable for your students? So you need to think about that. In terms of speaking, the speaking strand of a textbook, you want to see as much as possible are the activities that the students are encouraged to do to practice speaking, are they authentic? Is this the kind of task that they would have to do in their day-to-day life? The more authentic the task for speaking activities, the more motivation they will have to actually go and do that, to practice that. There's nothing worse than being in a class and the teacher asking you to do something which you think, why on earth would I want to be doing that? It's very, very demotivating. So, as much as possible, authentic tasks, role plays of genuine interactions they might have every day. There should also be a little bit of input on pronunciation of the language. Is it overt? Is it systematic? Are they using the same symbols, for example? If you're teaching the IPA, with your students, does the textbook also use the IPA symbols, or are they using a different set of symbols, and so on? And as much as possible, they should also be encouraging natural speech, or perhaps real world speech, if you like, where, spoken grammar can be a little bit different from more formal written grammar. So does the textbook point that out and encourage them to use natural spoken language? In terms of reading, it's a great idea to make sure your students are reading a variety of genres because every genre will be testing different skills. For example, reading a bus timetable. You're going to be doing a lot of scanning down the page to find the right time and the right place. It's not about reading every single word. So every genre has slightly different reading skills that's required. So make sure the textbook covers a variety of different types of reading. And again, make sure that the readings are authentic, something that the students would have to be doing on a day-to-day basis or a similar task like that. In terms of writing, same sort of thing. Make sure the students are asked to produce a variety of genres. No good practicing essays all the time if they're not going to be writing essays in their life. Do they know how to write an email or a memo on a post-it note or a letter home to mum or a Facebook post? So practicing writing using a wide variety of genres is great, and that also helps them understand the different rules, the grammar rules and the vocab rules for those different genres. In terms of the grammar input from a textbook, make sure that the grammar is appropriate to the level, and certainly most of the well-known publishers do have that the grammar activities roughly match the level of language that the students are at. Vocabulary, make sure there is an overt section, probably throughout each unit, which deals with the vocabulary and not just a list of words, these are the words in this unit, but actually encouraging different strategies for learning the vocabulary. Not every student learns the same way, and you as a teacher probably know that already in your head, and you might have a bunch of strategies, in your back pocket to help your students learn, but do the textbook also teach learning strategies for vocabulary? And then sort of in the other category, there may be a few other things to think about when you're choosing a textbook. Number one, is there an online component? Many of the textbooks published, I'd say in the last 5 years at least, have an associated website where students who have purchased the book get a login code, for example, and they go to the website, type in their code, and then they can access a bunch of extra materials. And this is usually highly motivating because students love to do things online typically, and if it's really matching up with what they've done in class with you, it's a wonderful way to tie that all in together. So online activities can be super motivating as well. Another thing to think about is whether the actual subject matter that's discussed in the book is culturally appropriate. And by that, I mean not necessarily just in terms of a geographical culture, whether we're talking about, a New Zealand issues or UK issues. Certainly it is one factor, but also in terms of the ages and maturity of the student. No good using adult kind of topics to teenagers who are not thinking along those lines. So is the material really suitable both age-wise and, culture-wise to the students you're teaching? Also no good to go and, teach in, say, China and have a whole bunch of themes which are really super British, for example, because they may not be able to relate, in which case the motivation will just really drop. So yeah, and having a sense of identity where the students identify with the topics and the characters that are presented in the textbook is really important. And I guess my final list of criteria to think about is the practicalities. So pricing. If you're going to be requiring your students to buy the textbook, then is it set at an appropriate price range where it's affordable for the students or their families to purchase for them? When was it published? So some of the most popular textbooks might have a second edition, a third edition, because the publishers want to keep going because it's very useful. Sometimes they go out of print quite quickly. If they're not working well, a publisher will just cut that loose. And if it's going to be going out of print, you might not be able to get enough copies for everybody, or get the teacher's book, or get the audio CDs which go with it. So making sure that it's up to date enough that it's not going to be going out of print anytime soon. So my recommendation there is always, where possible, go with the latest edition or the latest version of a particular textbook in order to not be caught out. And I have had some customers at the resource room where this has been an issue for them. They've actually liked a previous edition or version better, so they've started going down the road of using that in their class, only to discover that it's been discontinued and they can't get copies of the audio CDs anymore, and that's just a little bit devastating when you've started planning for that and have to change tack halfway through term or something like that. So there's just some practicalities. I hope you found that a little bit useful. As I said, I've put this into a downloadable chart for you, so you can just have it as a reference next time you need to be changing textbook or wanting to see what else is out there. These are some things you might like to think about. A short and sweet podcast this week. I hope you are doing well. Drop us a line. I'd love to hear from you. Feel free to send us a review as well. Otherwise, I'll see you next time. Thank you for listening to the Language Fuel podcast. You can navigate to the show notes and links via our homepage at www.languagefuel.com. See you next time.